So just to repeat that, as we get started here, as we wait for more people to join, we're going to start talking about signals and talk through some examples of signals. And I'll talk through one example of what seemed like it could be a signal but wasn't one. And then I'll turn it to you to share what else you've observed. Amara, I see you had a hand up.
Oh no, I thought you were asking if we had some examples. So yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's talk through this one idea and then let's jump right over to that first then. So one example, though, someone had looked at an election that had taken place in their country, and they said, "Hey, this election of a conservative government is a signal of, and here's what I see is going to happen." That signal by itself might be too broad to be a signal. If we say instead, this conservative government has been elected, and they say that they are going to change tax policy in XYZ way, or we could take the Trump examples of creating import tariffs or getting rid of income tax or deregulating certain specific industries and saying which industries we're talking about. When we have something very specific like that, then we can more easily take it as a signal. And then we start extrapolating from that. What does that signal mean? That when we have something really broad, like there will be a new curriculum for the schools. Okay, it could be that's not a big enough thing to change to be a signal, but it also could be that that new curriculum for the schools, it just simply could be too broad. If we say religion will be taught in the public schools in Texas as part of literature class, which is something they're debating about right now, and then okay, that's a really specific thing, and we can say how will that impact society, and we can even try to make our estimates, even though they might be still somewhat guessing, how that might play out 10 or 15 years from now. But we want with our signals to be as specific as possible. Amira, what was the signal you had? And then my after.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Who did you call on?
First you, because you had your hand up
Oh,
before,
okay. Sorry, I didn't
and then
quite hear
my
my
right
name.
after.
Sorry.
Sorry, no, I
Yeah, no,
said too
so the
fast,
signal.
maybe.
It's okay. No, so I'm in the education space or the learning and development space, and I know that a lot of people are, a lot of organizations are somewhat moving into more e-learning. So, and also universities too. So I think a signal is that traditional education is shifting, and then the idea would be like, how do you then better prepare professors, teachers, those who create content for school and so forth? How do you create that the a better platform for them or planning to really be able to replicate education as it were, maybe in a more efficient way. So,
So we want to try to, again, the more narrow we can make this, do we see this as this, maybe this is happening at all levels, but if we could say a specific thing, like secondary school education is moving more towards online learning, or if it's like university education moving towards online learning, or specific, if we go even specific to saying like dentistry students are studying online now and they couldn't before, like the more specific we go, the deeper we can go into what the implications of that are. But
mm,
otherwise, we can still do a scenario of saying, like, yeah, 10 years from now, like maybe we won't have in-person schools. Here's what it's going to look like. But we won't be very specific. It'll still be a very broad case. It's faster and it's easier because we can then put that over all examples. But if we say something really niche, like dentistry students will study online and they'll have tools and models they can see in 3D that even though they're remote and dentistry students need to do surgery and understand things, they can now use this metaverse to do dental surgery online. Then we then do that for each and every sector. So it becomes a
mm,
very complete and very full thing. But then more niche we make it, the more realistic we can make each of these assumptions and these models. Because
mhm,
obviously our online education in primary education will be so completely different than university education and will different things we adjust in different spaces. So maybe we'll even start adjusting it to what it's going to look like in different countries. Like maybe our
mm,
geographies even. If you're close to the capital city of a country, maybe it's less necessary for you to do online learning because the real teachers are right there close to you. But
mhm,
maybe if you're in the countryside, this is going to be completely different. So now you don't have to move, you don't have to change home if there's internet access available 10 years from now or whatever exists in 10 years instead of internet access, then, then maybe that will just completely change our scenario. Part of what we're going
okay.
to do before we go to Maya with the next example today is we'll be taking these signals and practicing building scenarios with them. And that's really the main skill to get out of today's session is how do we go from a signal to build a scenario, especially if it might be combining two or three signals together that at first might seem totally unrelated. But if we say, hey, here's different signals I'm observing, yeah, I could either make a model of a future scenario based on one of these, or I could say, how do these different scenarios I'm seeing relate with each other? And how do they combine to make this new future that we might see? Maya, what did you have?
It's all good. My question has already dissolved. I think your answer
Oh,
already answered my
okay.
question. Thank you.
Hope in a useful way. So for Katya, since you just joined, we're just going through some examples of signals and talking through some of them. And then from there, we'll go into our slides. And as I was saying, we'll go into building scenarios from there. Did anyone
Great,
else have a
thank you.
signal they want to share?
Mm.
Okay. Then I'm going to start going into the slides and feel free to just jump in, especially with a small group here, whenever there's any question or comment on anything here. So I'm not going to be able to see the chat once I listen to presenter mode. So really just speak up instead of raising your hand in this case. And I see one of our classmates is sending me messages. Let's see what that message is. So I
Oh,
respond. It was Nicola who's on. All right. So this session, so crafting future scenarios. Do you guys see the slide now? Crafting future scenarios, signals to 2040. All right,
mhm.
great. So pitch 2040 just for something that's more than 10 years into the future, to have something where we're at a timeline where everything could be totally different than it is today. Again, we've talked as well about futurists or about signals already, but the idea of the future scenarios is we want to build something where we build a world where we describe everything about that space in as much detail as we can. And so we really want to try to feel what it's like. Today's session will just be a short session talking through what it feels like or what we think would happen if we were in one of these scenarios. But a more effective or longer way to do this would be say if with a team of people you're working with who are working in a similar space to you or have similar interests, if you're working together and maybe over 10 or 20 days, you're journaling every day, like waking up
Mm.
and acting as if that scenario is a real thing and thinking, well, what would I do in this scenario? And then journaling and sharing that with the rest of the group. And then collectively at the end, seeing what did we come up with? What are the new ideas we had? How did it feel? And could this help us be more ready if the scenario really happens? Like about 5 years before the corona pandemic, I think around 2014, 2015, there was a scenario where several thousand people participated in the preparation for if there was a mass pandemic that came out. And people who'd been part of that scenario felt more ready when corona actually happened. And so things like this, yeah, they're not guarantees that these things will happen, but they make us feel more ready when something like this comes up. And they also make us think of maybe new opportunities and new directions we want to go in. So we go back to the signals, like we've been talking about so far today, and like we've talked about last session. Again, the signals are these indicators of emerging trends, these indicators of changes that could be coming. And so we really want to look widely for these outliers. Maybe as we talked about in the last session, as there's more detail on the slides, maybe we're looking at someplace like Reddit. Maybe we're looking at Facebook groups. Maybe we're thinking about like what new things we've heard, what rumors maybe even we've heard at conferences or events we've been to, what we see reading a wide range of newspapers or academic journals. But really, it's those ideas of things that stand out as, hey, that's a new thing that could totally change. In our Miro board, we have quite a list. Let me see if this loads. Yeah, of things like medical advances, maybe things Apple announced, Elon Musk creating a signal for interplanetary travel, a list of 20 inventions for the future. It's a short YouTube video. Uh, Denmark producing zero waste in one of its towns, medical advances for the brain. Like there's a variety of things out there from very different sectors from each other. But these signals are things that we then look at. And maybe if it's even if it's something outside of our industry or outside of our space, we might consider how does it impact us? Like me, I've been working in emerging tech, but I wouldn't have thought about infectious diseases very much. But had I been part of of one of these sessions dealing with what would happen if a pandemic like COVID came out. Would I have changed my business planning? Would I have said, hey, let's invest in Zoom. Let's create more online event management tools. But it can be something that certainly gives us clues and ideas, even if it's something from a different industry, and we can start thinking of how those other sectors impact us. So there's steps for creating these future scenarios. Yeah, we want to collect signals, as many of them as we can that seem interesting or useful to us. Yeah, maybe a signal about archaeology is super interesting, but not useful for what you're doing for work. So maybe we don't bother collecting that one. But things that are impacting social change, things that are impacting our industries or technology, maybe there's a technology that impacts everyone. Maybe there's a law or a legal reform or a political or economic event that seems like it'll have a global impact. And we want to think, what will the ripple effects of that be 10, 15 years from now? Those are all things we may end up collecting. And we'll analyze these signals. We'll see, is there any patterns that are similar between these? Is there things we see repeating? If we see some of these things repeating or seemingly being tied together in a strong way, maybe this makes them more likely to happen. And we put a greater weight on the possibility of these signals leading to these scenarios coming true. And of course, we develop these scenarios. We create narratives, we create a whole story. Like if I create a scenario for 2040, and I'll be posting something on LinkedIn soon, one will be a 20 or three items coming up, but one will be a 2040 scenario of the US government like, and the impact of what's happened this past weeks in the US and like what could be the ripple effects? What if the Trump administration with a fully Republican Congress gets through all the things it talks about wanting to do? What would that cause the US and the globe to look like? And how would trade shift? And how would demographics shift? And how would the environment be impacted 15 years from
Hmm.
now? Another I'm looking at is agribusiness, like new technologies, new emerging trends. How could the new tools we see being used today, from blockchain to AI to IoT to drones and satellite imagery, what would that make agriculture look like in 2050? Or another, I recently did a big project in Madagascar last year, and based on that, I did an imagination that will be published by a Futurist Institute next week. That's looking at could Madagascar's governance look like in 2040? And how could these emerging technologies be implemented? What could be the possibilities that we go from Madagascar having maybe only 23% internet access and only 30% of the people speaking a non-local language, in this case French, to actually being something where it becomes a high-tech center? Like how could they become again like a Singapore type place? Like how could we really advance a country in a big way? And what could that look like? So a lot of these scenarios, when we create these scenarios, we say, what's the whole story that got to there? Who are the politicians? Who are the actors? Who are the people involved? What happened in society? What were the big shifts and the big changes? And we really try to make as complete a story as we can. In a way, you're almost like writing a novel. By the time you've done this, you may as well write some kind of science fiction novel about it, no? Because you've created all the context and the setting already. But within this, then you start to really live it and have it feel real. And so, like that, it becomes easier to see what would I do if this was happening to me? What would I feel? What would I need? And again, with that need, that starts thinking of what products, what tools people might be able to use that could be developed for the future. And how will this change my routine? How will this change my life? How will my habits be different? Any questions so far on this?
Hmm.
Peter, I have a
And then,
question.
please.
When you say it's like writing a sci-fi novel, are you saying
Hmm.
that it's like crafting a narrative for how you imagine a country could change?
Yes. It could be for a country, it could be just a city or community, it could be the whole world. But yeah, and maybe sci-fi I say because I think so much of the technology side of it, but even on the culture side, if if you imagine things that if in the 1950s we were saying, for example, that like gay marriage would be normal in the US, yeah, maybe people would have been like, oh, no way. Like things that are imagining a scenario, what would it look like? What would it look like if the traditional nuclear
Hmm.
family isn't a thing anymore and society and families are totally different? Or what would it look? So it doesn't only have to be a technology thing. We could look at social changes. We can look at economic changes. What if paper money is not a thing anymore? It's already fading in some ways. What what about environmental changes? What if like we decide we're going to forest all of our cities? How would that look like if we have forests and trees everywhere in a much greater degree? So it's not only technology, but it's thinking the sci-fi novel thing I say partly because it's looking at a scenario where changes could in these scenarios could be really big, really different. We're not looking at just incremental changes that are the things we could predict in the next 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, but really trying to imagine the ripple effects. And there could be very different directions those could go. Because 10, 15 years, that's long enough that really everything could change. If we consider, like, again, I mentioned the other sessions, Facebook. When Facebook first launched, it then 10 years later had 1 billion users. Once you had 1 billion people on Facebook compared to no social media use before, and that was a drastic change in how we communicate, how we organize ourselves. But it was something maybe unimaginable 10 years before. Or again, the example of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Maybe 10 years before the Berlin Wall fell, nobody could have imagined that coming. But again, it's imagining a scenario that's radically different, that's very different than today. And writing that
Absolutely.
narrative, yeah. Mhm.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Laura?
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, I mean, this is my first time joining your team, your group, your cohort, and my question is, it sounds to me like somewhat like backcasting. W- Are you familiar
Not
with
as
that
familiar with
term?
backcasting. Maybe you can explain.
Yeah. So backcasting is also this kind of is a way of um projecting what you would like to accomplish from where you're standing. So for example, maybe an organization would like to maybe there's certain things that an organization would like to fulfill or accomplish within, let's say, 5 years. They would kind of imagine what that would look like and then begin to think about where they're at and how to get there. So they start with what that might be like in the future and then backcast what would require them to get to that point. And in coming to this framework, um how do you know you're on the right track? Because you could also have a scenario that doesn't come up, right? Or doesn't actually uh materialize in reality, right? So how do you know that you're on the right track? And is it something that you constantly have to tweak along the lines? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, it is. So, yes, it is similar in a lot of ways to backcasting, the way you've described it. Just the difference is we're trying to go, a longer way out to the future. That 5 year system in the future still is pretty far out, but we can have more of an idea, be more accurate and more correct in where we're going within 5 years. So when we talk 10 or 15 years, we're trying to really imagine things that may likely may never happen, but we're rather challenging the possibilities. Maybe we do think of something really creative and we're like, hey, that seems unlikely, but we'd actually really like that to happen. How can we make that happen? And then you start figuring out how to work towards it, similar to backcasting. So far as if you know you're on the right track and how you know, one of the things you do with this is often using what's called the Delphi method, which is similar to the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, where you go and you talk to experts and see what they're saying. This idea is you just simply talk to lots of experts. So you figure out, okay, I'm working in agriculture, trying to imagine what could happen in the agriculture space. I'm going to talk to as many experts in the agriculture space as possible who I think may have expertise on this topic, and I'm going to ask them about what they're doing. So, like another person in the BMW Responsible Leaders Network right now is working on a similar project with regenerative agriculture and trying to bring together many experts in that space and get their feedback and get their ideas and get their opinions of what they see as a likely scenario and what they see as possibilities. And so, yes, you could build these scenarios in isolation, and oftentimes it is done that way. But if it's not a space you know, especially like if I were to do the future of the automotive industry, and I don't know much about the details of the automotive industry beyond the experience of being a driver and buying cars every 4 or 5 years. So I would talk to as many people in the industry as I could and try to get their expertise and try to distill their wisdom together and see if if I can, on balance, make it seem like the right scenario, and then maybe keep bringing that scenario back to some of the trusted experts. Say, hey, after talking to another 10 people, another 20 people, this is what I came up with. Does this make sense to you as a possibility? Or could this be different? And that way, as you say, you keep getting feedback and you keep testing the idea. Was that did that cover both questions, or was the first statement second question? Is there another question
Yeah.
still?
No, that's thank you. That's really
Okay,
helpful. Yeah,
okay.
that's really helpful. I think that using the Delphi method, and because I'm just trying to see like, yeah, how do we utilize this to solve problems that we may not even know exist? And yeah, it makes sense to have that to use that Delphi methodology to kind of get people, industry experts to help, yeah,
Yeah.
make the decision in a sense. So yeah,
And
thank
the
you.
questions of like things, questions we don't know exist. I mean, I hate to quote a neocon politician from the US, but Dick Cheney had the comment about the unknown unknowns. And those things that we don't know. And again, each of those individual experts, even though they might be the experts in their field, that there's a lot of things they don't know. And so again, with the Delphi method, when you've spoken to maybe 10, 20, 30 of these experts, and you are the point that's bringing together this knowledge of the samples of knowledge they each had, you can go and try to distill that and see maybe you're bringing back the knowledge they didn't know. And and by, well, simply by becoming, making yourself a repository of all those ideas, hopefully you can come up with new things to make that scenario and discover some of those unknown unknowns. Sven, I see
Brilliant.
your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought maybe going in a similar direction. I mean, we've been talking about the signals as something that we saw and observed, but in some cases, as you just said, the known unknowns or unknown unknowns. So the blind spots are as or even more important. And I was wondering if you had any advice or methodology on um, how to look at or how to avoid biases and wishful thinking in the process of developing a scenario. Because you might talk to experts, but even though they're all experts in the field, they're not representative enough. And I think that comes a lot like back to us when like making these exercises and being very aware of our own blind spots, essentially.
Like I would say as diverse of a group of opinions as possible is the best way to avoid those and to challenge those biases. I would think about, for example, major management consulting firms that obviously have some of the best educated, really smart people. Many of them are members of our networks, but largely they've all went to the same schools. like, like, great, you've got a whole bunch of Harvard and Oxford grads giving you advice. They're all really brilliant, they're all really smart, but they've been educated in the same place. So they're going to have similar biases to each other. And so, to the degree that you can seek out what are the fringe ideas, what are the experts that maybe other people say are radicals, or maybe the people who are challenging the rest of the industry, that space you're in. And this could be expert interviews, this could be searching for Reddit groups or like online commentaries or blog posts, but really trying to see, okay, I know this is what I am interested in, I know this is what I focused on, and these are the people I know. But who are the people that I don't know that are working on that? Or who are the people who I normally wouldn't speak to? So maybe if I'm going to speak about the impact of Trump's policies in the US, maybe I should actually speak to some people who are like strong Trump believers and see why they think what they think, and challenge my views, ask them why they believe they want they look at that. So those contrasting perspectives, and I think AI gives us an extra tool for that as well, of simply saying like, here's my argument. What are the biases you think might be coming through in that, and what can you challenge? And although the AI tools sometimes are biased because of what their training data was, that makes it a bit harder. But still, you can tell it, you are this persona. Answer me questions from that perspective, and then maybe give it a new persona, then give it yet another new persona, and keep by yourself challenging the arguments with an AI tool if there's not all the experts you need readily available. A mini Delphi method or an AI Delphi method in a sense. But definitely the biases are a big thing. You'll see in the Miro board, there's one section of the notepads there that were just a space to paste biases and ways we think about biases and articles about biases, because that's definitely a big risk and a big danger that we have of creating scenarios that aren't as realistic because of that. The last thing I want to add to that, though, is these scenarios, we're creating these to challenge reality and challenge what's possible for the future, but we're not trying to have a crystal ball and actually predict the future, right? We kind of see it's rather looking at what are the outliers, what are the things that are not maybe unlikely to happen even, but what are the things that stretch our creativity and stretch the likelihood of what's happening. Like we could say for financial markets, yeah, most likely New York and London and Tokyo will continue to be major financial markets. And most likely in the next 20 years, that won't change. But what if it did? What would that look like? How would the world economy be different if instead it was Nairobi and Johannesburg and Sao Paulo that were the major markets, and also New York and London didn't matter anymore? Like, and how would that impact us? And so it's, yeah, but now I'm rambling, sorry. Other questions, other comments? The test and refine point at the end, number four here, that's exactly what you all were getting at with the questions, though. How do we know if it's a good scenario? How do we understand if we're going in the right direction? This is really, yeah, going, whether it's going back to other experts, whether it's creating our own virtual experts on AI to ask questions of, we definitely want to keep poking holes and asking, well, what was my bias when I made this? And what influenced me? And what were the inputs I had? So it's definitely a key thing to test and refine what we come up with.
Okay.
The mirror board link I can send to you afterwards. I can't open it easily. Well, oh, good. Somebody else put up. Thank you.
Yeah,
You
put it
are
up. Yeah. Can I ask a
great.
question?
Please,
Like another question?
please.
Yeah, sorry. I'm really enjoying this. Um, so the question is, what is the demand for this kind type of skill? And yeah, have there been examples of this? Like examples of this type of framework that's actually come true or have been implemented using this?
Well, like the COVID pandemic is one of the easiest examples to point at. The Institute for the Future, based out in Silicon Valley area, they were the ones who around 2014, 2015 ran a pandemic scenario. And they had maybe 4,000 people that were involved with this globally, putting up their journals and writing their comments of what they thought would happen and how they would feel in that scenario, what they would do to be prepared for it. And so those are when the COVID-19 pandemic actually happened, you had a few thousand policymakers globally who had actually been through a virtual scenario of something like this before. You can also think of high school programs like Model UN, where kids are simply practicing if they were in the General Assembly what they would do. I did that at age 14, but but that's again something where people are getting training, learning of what they could do in different scenarios. The military is the biggest example of these kind of things because they're always either doing war games of short-term scenarios, but they also are creating longer-term scenarios based on, well, what if XYZ new technology they're developing actually works? And what if their enemy also does the same thing? And so military organizations are a clear one where they're creating things like this. I think most private sector companies, when they do this, it's not being shared with the public because right, they're doing this for product development to understand new markets, new directions of where these things are going. So if you look at the Institute for the Future website and other big futurist institutes, you'll see they list a lot of big name corporates on there. But it's only really the management consulting firms, the companies that are making money from giving this advice, who are publishing pieces about it. Because if I'm Procter and Gamble and I'm making all these consumer products, I don't want to tell the direction I think trends are going and what products I think people will be buying because I want to be the one doing that, and I don't want to tell my competitors what direction I'm going. So that's it is there is growing demand on the space. I'm sorry, my dogs are barking in the background. It's a bit annoying. But we have that scenario where right now the term futurist is becoming more and more widely used. And you'll start seeing more people calling themselves a futurist, more people focusing on that space. 10 years ago, people who were working on this space already were a smaller amount, but they would call themselves a researcher or an analyst. You have less people doing this kind of work. It was a smaller space, and it's almost become a buzzword now, where some people have talked about the trope of euphoria, where a word becomes really popular, like kind of like a blockchain or other things at some point, and then it becomes like a word like, oh, let's not use that word anymore. It becomes less popular. This is getting to be where more and more people are calling themselves futurists and talking about the futures and forecasting space. I think more big companies are seeing the need for this. And so that's within like the American, I'm a part of the Association of Professional Futurists, and that's something they've been talking about within that as well, of seeing more and more people who don't necessarily have a tie to the space who just start working in the space and calling themselves that. And simply because it's an attractive thing and there's more demand for the skill. So again, we see there is training organizations, like, I mean, we're doing obviously basic training now in this, but the Association for Professional Futurists has trainings, the Institute for the Future, there's some universities with programs on this. University of Houston has an entire master's degree program on futurism, so does the University of Hawaii. And it is a growing space though, and a growing space of demand for it. Sorry, too long of an answer for a short question. So when we look at the scenario development, we're looking at the trends first, right? We take these short-term events, what we see happening of signals, and try to extrapolate these trends into the future. So again, not just looking at these 2, 3, 4 years out, but really looking at, well, what do we think could come from this 15 years into the future? If Trump implements tariff policy that it means like 10% tariffs on every import to the US and getting rid of income tax in the US, what would that mean for the US and for the world economies? Then we start to look at cross-impact analysis, how these different trends might interact and influence with each other. So if we say maybe we have trade policy as one topic, but then we have another topic maybe on family structures. Well, how will these things, they're totally different fields. How could these cross with each other? How could they impact each other? And the futures wheel is a tool where we actually just make a graphic, right, of showing all these different futures and trying to think of the different possible scenarios. So maybe if I'm talking about trade or tax policy, maybe there's many different directions I see that could go. And I keep turning the wheel of how this tax policy thing could impact society policy or family policies or family structures. And if family and society go different directions, how would these tax policies impact them differently and vice versa? Then let's throw technology into it and see how technology impacts that. And not just technology broadly, but we'll pick something specific like we'll say, okay, families using social media as a way to coordinate or plan with each other. And how would that impact? And so the future's wheels, we start turning the wheel of looking at how these different scenarios might fit with each other, different signals could fit with each other depending how they play out. Next slide to load. Oh, not too far. Oh, I think actually, okay. So as an example, I've got some more scenarios here, or some signals rather that we could use to build a scenario. And these are signals that are on the Miro board as well. And as we'll see, they seem very different than each other. One of these signals was there's researchers who found that iron fertilization of the Pacific Ocean could actually stimulate phytoplankton growth. What does this mean? It means that by putting tons of iron into the ocean, they would actually remove 50 billion tons of CO2 by 2100. And this is specific to the Pacific. It could happen the same with other oceans, but they did this study, they did the research, and they're saying, hey, when we put iron into something with phytoplankton growing, which creates CO2, we can reduce its growth and there'll be less CO2. And so this is a really niche, right? Like I tell you to be very niche with what we pick for signals. Okay, phytoplankton growth in the Pacific Ocean, preventing it with iron. So very specific. But we look at this and we say, okay, so how would this look? This could be by 2025, maybe they do large scale pilot projects of this. Maybe by 2030, we start to see big ecosystem changes coming from it. By 2040, our goal was 22,100 to eliminate this massive amount of CO2, but by 2040, maybe we see measurable results already coming from this. And we could go further on this. We could say, well, maybe within this scenario, what would it be like if I'm somebody who's living in a place that's maybe impacted by this? Like, will this decreased CO2 emissions be quick enough to slow sea level changes and impact me if I'm living on Vantua or one of these islands that's close to the sea level that's risking not existing anymore with rising oceans? Or will we see that with less CO2 emissions, maybe we'll have a slowed impact of climate change or a lowered impact of the temperature change? Maybe I'm a fisherman and I'll see more biodiversity of fish. Maybe at least fish that were at risk of going extinct will still be there. And this is where to really envision what happens in these scenarios, we would need people who have more expertise in this space, but to try to talk through it and make it really realistic. And this could be a full day activity explaining what this signal means and what impacts it would have. And we would need experts on phytoplankton and CO2 to be joining us and giving their feedback of what impact this would have on the marine environment and the people living near there, and then how that impacts the whole rest of the globe as well. But this could be one signal we could look at. And within this scenario, we could think about climate stabilization. Maybe global temperatures will start to stabilize because there's not as much CO2 coming out from the Pacific. Maybe marine ecosystems start to change already. But I wonder as well, will it be different things that thrive in these iron-rich waters than what's growing there now? Again, that's where we'd want to have experts and use the Delphi method to see what that would actually look like. Signal number two, this is about nuclear fusion. And this is something where they're talking about another way to create clean energy through radioactive power, but fusion compared to nuclear power we have today doesn't create waste. It's something that they talk about in Star Trek, like for any Star Trek fans, the warp drive engines, the engines of their spaceships being powered by nuclear fusion. So great, they were talking about the concept of it in the 1960s with Star Trek. Now they're actually saying, hey, we actually might be able to make this. And they're looking at how they could make breakthroughs on that. And could there be a cleaner way to create energy? So when they look at this, they're saying, well, what if by 2025 we could actually have a commercial scale fusion reactor ready? What if by 2030 it was working well enough to contribute to national grids? What if by 2035 it's cost competitive with traditional energy? What if by 2040 we're creating 20% of our energy through nuclear fusion and using less coal, less oil? How will that impact the big energy companies? Will it be Shell and BP that start taking the lead in this space as well? Or will we see different countries making this and different big companies making these products and the energy industry globally shifting? How will that impact employment? How will that impact opportunities? We can look at this as being maybe there's energy abundance then, maybe there's an economic boom, maybe there's environmental recovery as we use less fossil fuels, maybe more global cooperation, or maybe our global centers of power change as oil and coal and gas maybe matter less than they do today. Or maybe the nuclear fusion thing doesn't work at all. But in this scenario, if it would, where can we extrapolate from this signal? Signal three, let's look at societal changes. Korea, they've had a super low birth rate in Korea. Similar to Japan, similar to a lot of Western European countries, the birth rate is really low. But the traditional family has always been a very big deal in Korea. And for them, it's a really big deal that in 2023, almost 5% of births were outside of marriage. And there was a 40% decline in marriage, and still the fertility rate is less than one child per woman. And so the lowest fertility rate, but more of these childbirths happening outside of marriage. So again, for Korea, this is a big change in their society. In this case, again, we're not talking about technology, we're talking about social changes. And just to give the example that social changes, we can use these tools with too. We could see this as extrapolating this signal to show that maybe non-traditional family structures will become more widely accepted in Korea. Maybe the government creates policy shifts that adapt to the fact there's more diverse family types, whether this is social payments, whether this is benefits packages, the way schools are run, the way naming is done. And maybe this impacts the demographics of Korea and their birth rates and other aspects. And we're doing a very quick, what could be like a full day for each of these three scenarios, just for the purpose of our own timing here. But again, this 2040 scenario, maybe both the family is redefined and maybe the workforce also evolves. Again, maybe flexible work arrangements and AI augmentation start to address some of the labor shortages they face as well. Now we look at how can we interconnect these things. If we take these three scenarios we've done and we talk about climate stabilization, we talk about societal transformation, we talk about global demographic shifts, what if these changes in tools to reduce emissions for the climate, tools or technologies that might increase the abundance of energy and global demographic change and family structures, what could this mean if we interconnect these towards a global scenario we built? we look at potential challenges in 2040, we could say, well, could some of these large scale climate interventions have unintended changes? So this is where we're looking back and questioning. And this is that point four of when we make our models and we go back and question, are these good models? As well as questioning what could be the problems that come up in these models. Even if the model or the scenario is good, what could be challenges that we don't envision right now that we need to think about if this model would come true? And maybe we have this large scale climate intervention, for example, like putting iron into the Pacific Ocean, and we see, okay, it decreases CO2 emissions. It had its impact, but maybe the ecological balance of the Pacific Ocean totally changes by putting all this iron into it. So we have to think, what are the risks of changes that could come? With population dynamics, we think about what are the problems we could face from rapidly changing demographic structures? Like, okay, great, there'll be more acceptance of more non-traditional families and new family structures. And what are the needs that people will have different in a society that looks like that compared to the traditional society, say in Korea? Will childcare needs be different? Will after school care be different? Will just the social benefits that people need be different? How do we prepare for that? And then last, the energy transition. Of course, many internet networks were at COP last week, or this week may still be there at COP 29, and we think about the energy transition and are there unintended consequences? Will there be, we have cleaner energy perhaps with these new systems. Will there be societal problems happening in the countries that depend on oil right now? Could there be more revolutions? Could there be more migration of people leaving countries that currently are really rich countries because of their oil if we don't need their oil anymore? Or do they manage to use their assets and their wealth to diversify their industries in a way that they transition to the new type of energy? We think about opportunities that could come up as well, wild cards, unexpected events. Maybe extraterrestrial contact isn't the likely one, but still, there could be things that completely change what we're thinking. Maybe quantum breakthrough, maybe quantum computing just upends all the things we're talking about and totally changes what we're looking at. Maybe there's a global consciousness shift. I see more people talking about regenerative economics and agriculture. I see more people talking about maybe the current capitalist system, the way it works, isn't actually working. Maybe our representative democracies are facing challenges these days. Will there be just a complete different change in the way we think and view humanity that we can't imagine right now? So these we put in as wild cards as things that could just be a completely different scenario. So again, we want to prepare for multiple futures. We want to think of as many of these scenarios as we can, as much as we have time for, or it seems realistic for our organization, to go through and pick as many signals as could impact us, and think of the various ways that these signals could come up and could impact our organization, and really to be flexible, to be ready, and this continuous learning. This is where we keep finding new signals, right? Like keep scanning the horizon. Horizon scanning is another specific way that this skill is called of looking for signals. Like look at the edge of the horizon, look at what could be coming. Horizon scanning is very tied in with that continuous learning of seeing what's there. Can we keep using and that cross-disciplinary collaboration? Again, looking at these scenarios from other perspectives, whether it's you actually taking a course or reading articles about things outside your zone of expertise, or whether it's bringing in experts from other industries. So when you do a scenario and you say, hey, I don't know much about marine fisheries, but I live near the coast and I think it will impact what we're doing. Let's bring some experts in that field to us. And let's bring a diverse group of experts. If we want to talk about fisheries, maybe we bring in, on the one hand, the environmental scientists and people protecting nature, but maybe I want to bring Kim Gordon, the head of Gorton Fish, and I want to bring her there too and talk about commercial fishing and what her company does globally with fish. So we want to get the diversity of perspectives. Again, that challenges our biases that way too, the cross-disciplinary collaboration, but also cross-region, cross-cultural is the way that we have the diversity of ideas and diminish that risk of bias harming with the ideas we come up with, or bias limiting the ideas we develop, rather. So to conclude this, navigating the future, we're trying to embrace uncertainty. We're trying to act with foresight, trying to use these scenarios to make informed decisions as we shape and design our future. And the whole idea of this is really that we want to stretch our imagination. We want to see what are these to try to determine what are these unknown unknowns? How can we get to them? How can we think of them? How can we really push our imaginations so that we think of the future we want and we can start designing it? Because right now, many organizations make that short-term strategy based on what the current factors are and the current things impacting them. But if we could think long-term, 10, 15 years out, what do we want the future to look like? What do we want it to look like for the world? What do we want it to look like for our country? What do we want it to look like for our company or our industry? And then we start thinking, well, how likely is that scenario we want to happen? And if it's not very likely, what are the action steps we can do to make that happen? Who are the allies we need? Who do we need to influence? Who do we need to work with to make that happen? And work together towards that. So that was the end of the slides and the content for today. And I wanted to then transition just to a space for more questions, discussions, maybe talking through either these scenarios I've put up here or other ideas for scenarios you have, or maybe from a signal that you've seen, we can work on building another scenario and talking through it.
Peter?
Yes, Mara, yes.
Hi, hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. I apologize for arriving late. Um, I heard you say something about the Delphi method, and did you talk about that before I came? Because I that's something that I'm kind of curious about, and I've heard about it, but I
Yeah.
don't really understand it.
Well, the simplest way to view the Delphi method is talk to a lot of experts and try to come up with your viewpoint and idea based on talking to a lot of other people. I mean, yes, there's whole academic papers written about the Delphi method that make it much more
Okay,
complicated.
so
But
you like collect. Okay, okay. So basically,
yeah,
you
like think
collect
of who are all
questions.
the experts. Yeah,
Hmm.
like so maybe I say I'm going to work on agricultural value chains, how to reduce food waste. And so I'm going to talk to industry leaders who had agricultural companies, who had agribusiness companies, who run farms, who run trucking companies. I'm going to talk to border control and health and safety inspectors who handle food related issues. I'm going to talk to academics who research this area. I'm going to talk to the small farmers and the berry pickers on the ground. I'm going to talk to people who work in supermarkets. And so not all these are necessarily academic experts, right? But I'm going to get as many inputs, as many ideas as I can. And I'm going to, as I come up with new ideas, I'm going to try to circle back with some of these people as well. Because maybe my
Hmm.
initial idea has changed and evolved as I talk to more people about it. So I'll try to come back to these experts again and get a second feedback from them if they have the time for it or availability. Or at least my comments won't always be the same that I ask each person as I reach each succeeding person. Maybe what I'm sharing with them evolves as I have the feedback from others.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. And Amara, you see your hand up?
Yeah, Peter, thank you. Thanks again. So my question is there a protocol of questions or some kind of guideline, I guess, to begin to reflect on how to ask these questions? For example, if you had to lead such a session with, I don't know, a group of industry, like maybe, I don't know, like in my industry, I'm in le learning and development. So say universities who are, or a university is considering transitioning from traditional ways of learning and trying to project, say, in the next 10, 15 years, like what that might look like for their, say, engineering students. Like what kind of questions would you suggest would be a good way to lead in? Do you have a framework, some kind of guideline for that? I don't know if that was
Well,
clear enough.
no, that makes sense. I'm just opening up the Miro board because I'm trying to see if I can scroll over well enough from there. That's if it's stuck. But on the Miro board, one of the things here you see there's Foresight 2020. Jack Aldrich wrote one book generally about that space, about how to do foresight work and how to create these kind of models. That's one. I'm working on a tool guide. I want to put together two of sharing on this. But Michael Godet, he first wrote in the 80s. He's a French futurist who wrote this book in the 80s, did a revision, I think, in the late 90s. But it's been kind of the key book in this space, and that's about scenario planning as a management tool. And the link on the Miro board that I give you, that's actually to the full PDF of the book. So you can download the PDF of that book from the Miro board.
Great,
And
thanks.
it's around 300 pages or so. So it's not the lightest of reads, but it's got a lot of detailed tools. Again, it's not going to have specific questions because those questions will be different for every sector and every industry. But you want to really think of like that scenario planning aspect of what you're starting with of what do you see as the changes happening? And what do you see as the new technologies coming? And think of who you're going to talk to, not just in the education space, but here you're really going to need to talk to the tech folks as well. I was saying, what are the tools they're coming up with? And you may even want to start with that because maybe you want to start seeing, well, what is Facebook doing with like the metaverse and education in there? And what are other tool providers making? And what is the technology there? Even if it's not intended for the education space right now, but maybe things people are using for gaming, for example. And then bringing those ideas to educators and saying, how would you feel about this? How comfortable would you feel with this? Could you imagine your students learning in this way? And the main thing I would say is like really getting to know whatever that signal is or that change that you see. So in this case, maybe it's technology. And and then once you know that thing well, and have talked to people in that space or read about it, then going to the experts for that traditional space and asking them how they would feel about it and how they would react and how they would use it, how they can envision it, and if they could envision it. Maybe a lot of them will just be who are more traditionally, no, I can't imagine it. That won't happen, or that's not the right way for it to happen. But then others may say, like, yeah, I could see this is why and this is how. But you also, with these scenarios, want to ask them if they can envision it happening, what would be the pros and cons of it? What could work better than, in this case, traditional learning, and what could work worse? Maybe there's more flexibility, and maybe people could learn at any time and from a distance, from any location, study any university from anywhere. But on the other hand, maybe that lack of personal contact and that lack of camaraderie with their classmates makes a big impact. And so that pro and con, that idea, first learning in detail that what you can about that signal, so you can ask really good questions and determine for yourself what are the good and bad things about it, and then going to those other experts that are in the industry you're seeking to analyze the changes of and saying, hey, here's what I see as something that could impact us. What do you see as the pros and cons of this thing that I'm bringing you, this signal, this artifact of the future? And also then find with what other things do you see? Maybe they see other signals that you haven't seen and they can share those with you. That's definitely something else you want. What other signals do these experts you talk to see in their industry or their space? I see your hand up.
Helpful. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm also trying to understand the signaling and also the environmental scanning part a little bit better. And I wanted to understand, is there existing clusters that could be used to sort the environmental scanning or horizon scanning that we did? For example, you mentioned a lot of examples of it, exploring academic papers, social media, niche blog, Reddit, and all of these. Are there like clusters that we could create or that already exist that we could use as a resource, either you already working with it or other experts think
Not
about that?
really yet. But one thing I'd be happy to create if people are interested in participating in it and even sharing this as far as you want to get more and more people into it is creating something similar to what we've done in Miro, but on
Mm-hmm.
Notion. The
Mm-hmm.
reason being that Notion stays up and is more permanent, and this Miro board will disappear after this class. Well, by the end
Mm-hmm.
of December, it'll be taken down. But what I would suggest is I could send invitations to all of you. You could feel free to send it on to others of saying, hey, as we find signals, posting them there, posting categories like within Notion, it's very easy, very low tech to just create new pages, like new files. And each of those could be a different category. And so if something doesn't fit into any of the existing categories, one could create a new category. And that would be a way of crowdsourcing these signals. And to the degree then that we could have just a broader net through which to fish. So maybe Amara is only going to focus on signals in higher education, but sometimes finds things in other spaces. Maybe I'm looking more at blockchain AI signals and and sometimes global politics. Maybe Maya, you're working in another space, but we're each then putting in our things from our space and then having a collective space we could look at it. That could be one way to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
I would start with as broad of categories as possible at the beginning. But then as things get more niche, or as there ends up being more content, then narrowing it down more and more. Like
Mm-hmm.
AI as a starting point could be okay, that could be one category of news about AI. But probably within a month, you'd have enough subcategories of that that would be too messy if it was left all in one thing. And so you quickly go AI in education, maybe AI in higher education, AI in primary education, and like break it down from there. So
Hmm.
short answer, no, there's not a tool yet. I'd be happy to create one and then share that with
Hmm.
everybody to start co-contributing or co-building that.
Hmm.
I'd be into that.
Sorry?
Okay.
I would be into that.
Ah, okay.
Fantastic.
Sorry. I
Glad
thought
to
you
hear
said
that.
I already built that. I was like, okay,
Huh.
impressive.
I
Even
Um,
would.
better if you'd already built it. Yeah. It
just
won't
to
be
build
super
on that,
high
I
tech,
think.
right? It'll just be like a Notion board where we can just keep sharing things. And maybe if it gets big enough, then there starts to be a reason to say, okay, now we'll create a new tool, or now maybe we create a way to organize it even better. But as Notion keeps developing, they've created AI tools. Someone I think could even use Notion's AI to search within our own thing, seeing what others have posted in our group. So if it ever got to the level where thousands of people were sharing and co-creating or co-crowdsourcing signals, I think
Mhm.
Notion and others like systems are developing more and more tools to sort that we could then use that search within the system we create and find things.
Peter, will you invite us to Notion then to create this?
I will. I certainly will happily. I'm glad that I
Mhm.
hadn't thought I had started making something just on my own in Notion, knowing that this mirror board is going to be taken down. But
Mhm.
yes, if others
I'd
are interested, I'm
appreciate an
happy to share
invitation
that.
if you would. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
Maybe also to build on that question. So I was not thinking of specific signals that we find, but rather like on a meta level and also the methodology behind it, because I've understand these methodologies that you mentioned correctly, environmental scanning, horizon scanning, and all of that. You just, so to say, systematically search for information across many different resources to identify these signals. But for me so far, I didn't really understand whether there's a methodology of really doing it strategically, because I imagine myself just going on a search. But I wanted to understand, is there like a resource to say, okay, first we explore niche blogs, we then analyze industry publications, then we look into social media, then we explore academic papers. Is there like a little bit more strategic approach to the search part of it?
Really,
In with regard to clustering it, because I'm just envisioning like a board and a map where I have, yeah, headlines and then these different categories underneath it, but maybe that
I think of it
already.
more from putting it by the categories of
Mhm.
like what the subject is than what the source is. Because
Okay.
it could be that you see something, let's say on some very niche page, like a commentator on Reddit or on TikTok, and maybe that's something that's actually a really important signal that you think is really going to make a big impact. And
Hmm.
then, but then somewhere else, there might be an academic paper that explains in much more detail how that would actually work. And so those are very different kind of sources, but they might be about the same topic or related to the same
Yeah.
topic. And the other thing is if you can make the connections sometimes, and this is something I'm playing with Notion, I'm not sure how to do well yet, but maybe someone else here is better at, of seeing if we can mark how strong the connections are between different categories. Because maybe there's an article about AI and education, and we put it in the AI category, but maybe there's a separate education category that's just broadly all of education, but that within the system, we can draw a link so that somebody's searching for it. Or maybe it doesn't have to be a link, maybe it can be we have a way of tagging or coding the articles that somebody else could easily find that these are related things to each other.
Hmm.
But so far as sorting, I would think you have to sort by subject and
Okay.
really just to the degree that you kind of just always tagging something and saving it. Like I'm sometimes taking screenshots of things,
Hmm.
sometimes just bookmarking a page, sometimes in my Apple Notes on the phone, I'm just like putting it into the notes function of like from what mainly recently it's been articles I want to write a short LinkedIn article or post about, so it's constantly there's something I'm like, oh, that's really great. I want to share that. I don't have time to write something now, so I'll save that and put it aside. Or if even if it's a paper notebook, to just scribble down, hey, remember to look up this website that I saved, or remember this thing. I think the biggest thing is just having some way where you keep track and you're finding it in the short term. Because if it's just, hey, I saw something and like, oh, I'll just bookmark it, I'll look back at it tomorrow. If there's not one place where you're saving things into, then it's more likely you're gonna, for me at least, I would forget about it or not get back to it.
Hmm.
And if we do commonly build a Notion board and we come up with a common way of tagging things, then
Hmm.
even better. Even if you see something and you're just like, hey, I don't have time to tag this correctly now, but I think this will be interesting to the community. I'm just going to tag it to the general page for now. with a notion, and either you or somebody else goes back and sorts what that goes to later. That could be another way we do it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, thank you
Those
for
ideas.
already thinking a few steps further and on how to implement this and build this.
Yeah.
Um, I have another question, but I want to give room for the others to ask their questions first.
Okay. Any others first? Sven, thank you for joining. Oh, I think you already left. If nobody else has something right away, then I guess Maya, back to you.
Yeah, but you just talked about these interconnected futures, and you built
Yeah,
these three different scenarios and then connected them at the end. I just wanted to understand, would I then go back to the signals and try and find signals for all of these interconnected futures again? And would it be like an iterative process, or would we then just you work with the interconnected futures that we build and then look into the future part of it? Did I
I think
explain my question
it,
correctly? Under-
as vague as this sounds, I think it depends what seems useful to you. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for example, these three scenarios that I interconnected, especially the Korean family structure, is
Mm-hmm.
probably not relevant for most people, right? And maybe you could extrapolate how that might be playing out in families in other parts of the world, in other ways. But even
Mm-hmm.
then, maybe that the family structure issue might not be relevant to your work. So I brought that in as a way to show that, hey, we can interconnect things that seem totally different than each other. But again, it might not be useful to interconnect things that seem so disconnected. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like just the fact that it's possible to create a scenario with things that aren't connected to each other, but maybe it's more useful and more efficient to say, we're going to look at as many niche things that are in similar related fields to each other. And and yeah, you could go back and say, is there something more closely tying these things that we haven't thought about? Maybe the Pacific Ocean is somehow having an impact on Korean family structures. Should we look at that since Korea is on the Pacific? But we also might say, hey, these things, yeah, we can connect them for a scenario. If we want this scenario to be really global, or if we want this to be specific to Korea, but here's issues from the broader environment that impact Korea. Let's tie these together. But we may also say, like, yeah, these things aren't really connected. We don't, or there are weak connections between them. Let's drop that. Whereas the phytoplankton in the Pacific and the fusion power, we could have a closer tie to them of saying, yeah, fusion power is going to reduce CO2 emissions. This phytoplankton reduction will reduce CO2 emissions. Maybe what other environmental things, what other things could we tie in with this? And what would the world look like if we had less CO2 emissions? And we can then think of what other signals we could think of what other signals to put into that. Or we could just say, like, how would industry, how would companies, how would whichever actor in that 2040 scenario look?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would Volkswagen look like if the energy sources totally were different? Or other car producers? How would it look for them? Or we could go in a different direction and say, what would schools look like? Maybe schools aren't directly related, obviously, these energy things, but if we have the issue of, well, energy is cheaper, energy is more abundant now. Maybe in some regions of the world where schools don't have electric right now, maybe there's more electrification. So maybe there are ways that we could look at how that ties in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
I'm glad to hear that. They don't always make sense. Anything else, Amara, Colette?
Um, oh, does anybody have a
Yeah, Kimo.
question? Okay. So,
No,
yeah,
I only saw three people on the screen, so that's why I didn't say Kimo. Sorry.
okay, no worries. So yeah, I guess my internet cut off for a second. I missed after comparing the three scenarios and seeing how they work with each other. That's where I got cut off. I was just wondering, I guess we just kind of talked about this a little bit. So what is like the easiest sort of most useful way? I mean, I do like you do, and I collect a lot of stuff, and then I have it scattered, and then I'm totally overwhelmed by all my little notes everywhere. So, what is like I don't know, like sort of the best way to approach this, the simplest way to kind of just have it ongoing with you, and you can add things to it. Is there a system or?
I mean, what I've been doing because I'm just too much on my phone, it's more even than my computer. I've been just putting it into Apple Notes constantly, and I've got one folder where I'm constantly putting scraps of notes. But that's not the best way.
Hmm.
What I what we were talking about, I think, when you were off was creating a Notion page, and I've started to do that I haven't done much on it yet, partly because, especially because I know that this Miro board will be taken down at the end of the year. So a lot of this content that I put into the Miro board, I'm going to be putting over to there. And so I want to create a Notion page that partly will be resources and materials, basically the content that we've went through in this class, but then partly as a place where everybody who, even beyond this class, who wants to contribute, could start adding signals into it, and then kind of crowdsourcing signals in that sense, and seeing if we can create a bigger vehicle by which we can all use it and keep digging into it. I think Notion is a really good space for that because I feel like its ability to take notes, to launch a PDF, to launch a document or an image in there, to share things, to make it publicly available or to make it password protected or to have certain parts that are either one. I feel like Notion is one of the best resources for doing that. So that's why I was thinking to build in there. And Microsoft's note-taking tool is also pretty effective for that. And I'm just looking at what's the easiest, most cost efficient. And I think Notion to me seems like one that would be, but I haven't done as much with it yet. So I'm
And so what
happy to
is
hear feedback.
Notion keeps a lot of notes and then makes PDFs out of them. I was just thinking maybe there's a way to have an AI that would constantly take the information we put into it and generate some kind of possible scenario.
That would be cool. I know that's one thing Notion has integrated an AI tool. I haven't experimented with that yet. But Notion basically it's a note-taking tool in the sense that, or one of its uses can be that. It can be used for a lot of things, but one can be we just have a collective place where everybody who's part of that community could be adding notes. And it could be that we have different folders and you create a folder of these are all my notes on AI tools and education. This is a folder for I don't know, blockchain tools and supply chains and have different folders for different categories. And then just as people in the community find things, you either could paste a hyperlink into there, you could, if maybe you've made a PDF of an article and you decide to upload the document into there, you could put the document there, maybe a picture or a diagram, you could share that directly there. And then it just becomes something we could all co-create of having a common space that could either be public or could be password protected, where everybody could keep putting things into there.
Cool. Yeah, I spoke a long time ago with a guy who, out of Berkeley, I forget where he's from originally. Anyway, he was making an AI tool that just you build a closed set of information and then it only works on that information. So who knows? Maybe that could be an
You can
interesting
do
thing.
that to a degree even with ChatGPT already. Of like if you create your own GPT, you upload only your data, and actually some of the competitors too, of course, and you can say, hey, based on the data I've given you, give me a document.
Hmm.
Like I had a paper last year I had a series of papers I wrote about Madagascar for UNDP, and somebody wanted a summary of all the three papers. And like they want one short document that gave the highlights of everything. And I didn't have the time to write a paper in French doing the highlights of the three previous papers. So I rather upload the PDFs of my three previous papers, said like write me a 5-page summary of the highlights of my three papers. Then I went through and did some light edits to it, but it pretty well did a summary, only looking at my content of what I gave it.
Hmm.
And so that's something that yeah, it's a really great time saver. So similarly to what you're saying, if we upload all these signals, you're right. You're totally right. We could just I think Notion does have an AI tool, but if not, yeah, we could see to what degree we could export things from there and put it into ChatGPT or Claude or whichever other one and say, like, hey, based on the new signals we found this month, what do you see as updating? And what can you envision as a scenario? Because also to the degree that we're training that GPT and to the degree that it remembers the previous things we've given it, we can have it grow and keep learning and keep adapting based on the new content, but keeping the old content in mind.
Sounds good. I'm
Why
excited.
AI tools are a really great thing for like a great cheat in a way for future scenarios now. Any other comments, ideas? Well, I've sent out an
I think.
email, which
Mhm.
did all of you get the email that came out earlier today or no? I'm not sure if everyone got. Okay. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing, by the way. I'll put into the chat some content that I put out, but basically there's a few links. There's the Miro board, which will be taken down. I haven't put the Notion page up yet. I still need to put that together and get that ready to share. But I've also got a WhatsApp group or if people want to keep going with questions on this, that's something that was created previously for another class. And but if people want to use that as a resource to share, put up ideas, especially before we get the Notion board up. And then I've
Hmm.
also got a newsletter I put out. Mostly it's been once a week. It's been 2 weeks since, or 3 weeks now since the last one went out. But I have a newsletter as well I put out. So I'll send out the links for all those things, or rather, I'll just put that into the chat now as well. And with that, I think that was the end of the content I had. So I'm going to end it,
I, oh,
and I'll
I
stick
just,
around though if you have questions for a few more minutes.
yeah, I was just gonna say.